Wyoming Territory. 1879, the first time Franklin Jude saw her. She was dragging two half-starved children through the dust of the Laramie Plains with blood on her dress and a shotgun in her hand. He was riding home from Fort Sanders with a fresh sack of flour and a cracked rib when he spotted them three figures moving slow against the wind like ghosts. The woman walked ahead, chin high, eyes sharp. The boy, maybe 10, limped beside her. The girl, no older than 6, clung to the woman's torn skirts, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Frank slowed his horse. "Ma'am," he said, his voice careful. "You need help." The woman turned, raising the shotgun without hesitation. Her eyes were dark, wild, and proud. "We're fine." The barrel did not waver. Frank held up both hands. Not looking for trouble, just looked like those kids could use water. The boy swayed. The woman noticed. Her jaw tightened, but she lowered the shotgun. "We need water," she said, "and quiet." He passed her his canteen. She took it with one hand, cradling the little girl with the other as she drank, then let the children take turns. The boy's lip trembled, but he said nothing. Frank looked closer. The woman's dress was torn at the sleeve, dried blood crusted near her shoulder. Her boots were mismatched. She looked like she had walked through hell and kept going. "You got a name?" he asked. She looked him dead in the eye. "Winona Steele." Frank studied her. She didn't fidget, didn't flinch, but something behind her eyes looked broken, not soft, just tired. "You and the kids headed somewhere?" She glanced at the horizon. "Away." Frank nodded. "Well, my ranch is 6 miles west. Got food, shade. You're welcome to rest there." Winona hesitated, then looked at the children. The boy was shaking now. She sighed and nodded once. "All right," she said. "But just for the night." The Jude Ranch sat in a narrow bend of the Laramie River, tucked behind cottonwoods and fence posts worn smooth by wind. Frank helped the boy off his horse, carried the sleeping girl inside, and let Winona walk on her own. She didn't say thank you, but she did not reach for the shotgun again. Inside, he lit the stove and set beans to boil. Winona sat at the edge of the table, silent, eyes following every move. The boy Oliver watched her more than anyone else. The girl, Olive, curled up on a pallet near the hearth and fell asleep with her thumb in her mouth. Frank poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs and slid one toward Winona. "You got people looking for you." Winona looked at the coffee, then at Frank. "They call me a devil's bride." Frank blinked. "Why?" "I married a man named Calvin Steele, preacher's son. Sweet words, hard hands." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "He died last week. I buried him myself." Frank watched her. "You kill him." She didn't answer right away. "Then I protected my children." Frank nodded. "That's enough for me." She looked at him, startled. "Just like that," he shrugged. "I saw a lot of men die in the war. Ain't all deaths a loss." Winona looked away. Her shoulders dropped just enough to notice. That night, Frank gave them his bed and slept in the barn. He lay on a pile of hay, staring at the rafters, thinking about the way she gripped that shotgun, the way she kept her chin high even when her knees looked like they might give out. Folks would talk, sure. She was already branded in town, he could tell, but he saw something different. When dawn came, he was already up, chopping wood. Winona stepped out onto the porch, her hair loose around her shoulders, the girl still asleep behind her. She looked at him for a long time. "I'll work," she said. "We will not stay for free," he nodded. "There's fences to mend. Coop needs cleaning." She walked back inside and came out with a bucket of water. Then she rolled her sleeves up and went to work. Days passed. Then a week. The children laughed again, just a little. Frank gave them space, but sometimes at night he saw Winona standing near the river, looking out like she expected someone to come for her in the dark. One evening, while mending a gate, Frank asked, "You planning to keep running?" Winona leaned against the post, arms crossed. "I do not know." Not much out there but more dust and men who think they can own you. She gave him a look. You think you can? He shook his head. No, ma'am, I think you deserve peace. She looked away. Peace is not something I know. Maybe you could learn. She said nothing. Just reached down, picked up a hammer and kept working beside him. 2 nights later, trouble came. A man rode up just past sundown, dust all over his coat and hate in his eyes. Frank stepped off the porch when he heard the hoofbeats. Winona was inside with the children. The man spat. Looking for a woman. Winona Steele took my brother's brats, killed him. Preacher says she's cursed. Frank kept his voice calm. Ain't no one like that here. You lying? Frank met his eyes. I reckon I am. The man went for his gun. Frank was faster. The shot echoed through the valley. The man fell, clutching his arm, screaming. Winona ran out, shotgun ready, kids behind her. She saw the blood, saw the man. She did not flinch. Frank turned to her. Go inside. I'll handle this. She stared at him like she could not believe what she was seeing. Then she nodded and pulled the children back into the house. They buried the man's gun and sent him limping back to town. Frank knew it would not be the end of it, but something shifted after that. Winona started sitting closer at dinner. She let the girl braid her hair again. And one night when Frank came in from the barn, she was standing in the doorway waiting for him. I never had a man protect me before, she said. Frank swallowed. You and those kids, you matter. She stepped closer. Do I? Or just them? He reached out, brushing a strand of her hair behind her ear. All of you. She looked up at him, breathing slow. I was never wanted, not really. Frank leaned in, his voice low. You are now. And then she kissed him. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was steady, real, and warm like the first fire after a long, cold season. When they pulled back, she whispered, I do not know how to love gentle. Frank smiled, his eyes soft. Then love me hard, and she did. By the time spring settled across the valley, the cottonwoods had begun to leaf out in pale green, and the river, fed by snowmelt, ran louder than before. The wind no longer bit through coats, but it still shoved across the plains like it had a debt to collect. Frank had taken to rising before the light, not out of habit but because he didn't mind the sound of Winona breathing beside him. She rose early too, though never before him. She liked the quiet after first light, when Olive still clung to her quilts and Oliver lay curled on his side, one arm braced protectively over his sister. Winona had stopped flinching when the floorboards creaked. She no longer checked the door twice before bed. Frank stood at the stove one morning, frying salt pork and eggs when Winona came in barefoot, hair still braided from the night before. She leaned her hip against the counter and folded her arms. I don't know how to be still, she said. He turned the eggs once, then looked over. You got something in mind, she glanced toward the window. There's a schoolhouse in town, abandoned since the cholera came through. If someone cleaned it up, there'd be a place for Oliver to learn his letters proper. Frank nodded slowly. You want to teach? I can read, she said. Write too. Calvin hated that. Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. But I'd teach more than scripture and penmanship. There's girls out there who don't know they can say no. Frank set a plate on the table. If you want it, I'll help you fix it up. She tilted her head. Just like that, he poured her a cup of coffee. You stood beside me when trouble came. That counts. She took the cup, her fingers brushing his. I'm not used to being counted. Then get used to it, he said. They ate in silence after that, but it was the easy kind, the kind that sat warm between them like a shared blanket on a cold night. Later that week, they hitched the wagon and rode into town, the children tucked between them beneath a wool blanket. The schoolhouse sat at the north edge of Laramie, its roof warped and its door leaning off one hinge. The windows were boarded, and weeds had claimed the steps. Winona climbed down first. She walked the perimeter slowly, her fingers trailing the rough wood. She didn't speak until Frank joined her by the back wall. "It's not much," she said. "It'll do," he replied. She looked up at him. "They won't want me here." He adjusted his hat. "Then it's a good thing I'm not asking." That afternoon they cleared the inside. Frank hauled out broken benches while Winona swept years of dust into the open doorway. Oliver found a robin's nest tucked into the rafters and spent 20 minutes whispering to the birds. Olive dragged a stick through the dirt and hummed to herself. By sundown, the place still smelled like mildew, but the floor was clean and the windows open. As they packed up to leave, the town's blacksmith, an older man named Terrell, approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped near the wagon and nodded toward Winona. "Folks been talking," he said. Frank stepped forward. "Then they can talk to me." Terrell's eyes shifted. "Preacher's been stirring them up, claims the woman's cursed." Olive gripped Winona's skirts tighter. Frank stared hard. "She's got more strength than any man I've known." "If you got sense, you'll leave her be." Terrell scratched his beard. "Didn't say I agreed, just passing what I hear." Frank's voice didn't rise. "Then maybe start hearing something else." Terrell nodded once, then turned and walked off. Winona didn't speak until they were halfway home. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." She shifted the reins in her hands. "I never asked for saving." "You didn't," Frank said, "but I'm still here." That night, while the children slept, Winona sat on the porch steps in her nightdress, watching the stars. Frank joined her, bringing a blanket and 2 mugs of tea. She didn't speak at first. The night was quiet except for the frogs near the river. After a while, she said, "I remember thinking once if I could just get out, I'd run until my feet bled. I thought I'd never stop." Frank studied her profile in the moonlight. "What changed?" "I did." She took a breath. "You didn't ask me to, you just waited." He set his mug down. "You're not who they say you are." She turned to him. "Then who am I?" "The only woman I'll ever want." Her eyes softened and she reached for his hand, her grip firm and steady. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The stars above them didn't blink. The wind rustled the cottonwoods, and inside the children dreamed with no fear. By mid-June, the schoolhouse walls held the scent of fresh lime wash and wood smoke. Winona had spent the better part of 3 weeks scrubbing, sanding, and stitching curtains from old flour sacks. Frank built a stove hood, carved a new bench, and repaired the slate board with salvaged pine. The children helped where they could. Oliver patched a hole in the roof with a carefulness beyond his years, and Olive sorted buttons for counting games, her tongue poking out between her lips in concentration. They had not spoken of leaving. Not even once. One afternoon, Frank returned from town with nails and a new ink bottle, dust on his boots and sun on his neck. He found Winona sitting on the schoolhouse steps, her skirts bunched around her ankles, a letter folded in her lap. Her face was unreadable. "Something wrong?" he asked. She handed him the letter without a word. The paper bore the seal of Judge Morley out of Cheyenne. The words were short and cold, like the man himself. A formal inquiry had been opened into the death of Calvin Steele, with a summons for Winona to appear before the circuit court in the fall. Frank folded the page and handed it back. "You were within your right." "That won't matter," she said. "Not to men like Morley." He crouched beside her, his voice low. "He doesn't know you." She looked out across the empty field where a single deer grazed beneath the cottonwoods. "They'll say I'm the kind of woman who ruins good men." Frank stood, then offered her his hand. "Then I'll stand beside the woman who ruins bad ones." She took it without hesitation. That evening, a wagon arrived at the ranch just as the sun dipped behind the distant hills. The driver was a woman in her 50s, her gray hair caught up in a kerchief, her frame narrow but upright. She introduced herself as Tilly Branner, widow and former schoolteacher from Sweetwater Station. "I heard rumor you were opening the schoolhouse again," she said to Winona. "I taught for 20 years. My eyes ain't what they used to be, but I can still read a child's mind." Winona looked at her with quiet surprise. "What made you come all this way?" Tilly adjusted her shawl. "I lost my boy 2 winters ago. Fever. After that, I couldn't bear the silence. Then I heard about a woman out here fixing up a place no one else would touch." She turned toward Frank. "My niece works at the courthouse in Cheyenne. Says Judge Morley's got a habit of making examples out of women who don't bow." Winona's jaw set. "I won't bow." Tilly nodded. "Then I'll help you teach. And when the time comes, I'll stand in that courtroom and say what I know." Frank stepped back to let the women talk. As they disappeared into the house, Olive asleep in Winona's arms, Oliver trailing behind, he walked toward the fence line, the sky above him streaked with lavender. The land felt different now, not just his, not just soil and grass, but something shared. The next morning, Winona joined him at the barn as he checked the tack. She leaned against the doorframe, a ribbon tied around her wrist. "I used to think love was something you had to earn by bleeding for it," she said, not looking at him. "But it's not. It's something you build." Frank set the bridle aside. "I ain't much for poetry, but you're right." She smiled, faint but real. "I want to marry you." He blinked, then laughed low in his chest. "Well, I was working up the courage to ask you the same." She stepped forward, placing a hand on his chest. "No church, no preacher, just us." He nodded. "Then let's say the words out by the river when the cottonwoods bloom." They did. A week later they stood by the water, the children holding wildflowers, Tilly humming a hymn beneath her breath. Frank took Winona's hands, calloused and strong, and spoke a vow as plain as it was true. "I'll walk beside you, through every storm and dry season. You're the only woman I'll ever want." Winona didn't cry, but her fingers trembled in his. "I'll choose you again and again, even when the world says I shouldn't." Behind them, the cottonwoods shed their white blossoms into the air, soft as ash, bright as snow. They returned home as husband and wife. No one came to stop them. No preacher's son rose from the grave. The land stayed quiet, and in that quiet they found something better than peace. They found a beginning. By late July, the fields had yellowed at the edges, and Winona kept a damp cloth tied around her neck as she hauled water for the schoolhouse garden. Rows of beans and turnips stood in neat lines by the fence, shaded in the afternoon by cotton muslin she'd sewn from flour sacks too threadbare to patch again. The children helped her most days, Olive humming as she picked beetles from the leaves, Oliver quiet but content as he built a scarecrow from worn shirts and straw. Frank had taken on more with the herd, riding longer stretches upriver to check the cows grazing near the foothills. He came home late some nights, his shoulders carrying the kind of weight that didn't come just from saddle hours. Once, she caught him staring at the horizon too long after supper, his jaw unmoving, his hand resting near the edge of his plate like he'd forgotten it was there. "You expecting someone?" she asked, folding the dish towel across her lap. He didn't look at her right away. "Heard from a deputy out of Rawlins," he said finally. "Judge Morley's pushing your summons harder than before. Says he wants to set a public example before the harvest court closes." Winona didn't flinch. "He'll get his chance." Frank set down his fork. "I don't like how it's shaping." "Tilly'll testify," she said. "So will the midwife from over in Rock Creek. And I'll speak for myself." Frank leaned back in his chair. "You ever think of what comes after if they make it hard?" "I've thought of everything," she said. "And I'm not running." Later that night, she found him in the barn, oiling the rifle he'd kept beneath the stairs since spring. He didn't raise his head when she stepped in. She didn't ask what he was doing. She just walked to the rail where the lantern hung and blew it out, leaving only the moonlight between them. "I know what I lived through," she said. "I know what I am now." Frank stood, the rifle set carefully aside. "And what's that?" Her voice stayed low. "Not a thing I'm ashamed of." He came to her then, not with urgency, but with a steadiness that had become his way. He rested his forehead to hers and said, "You're the only woman I ever wanted. Ain't a court in the territory can argue that out of me." She pressed a hand to his chest, right over the place she'd come to know as home. "Then we'll walk into that room together." The summons came 2 weeks later, delivered by a man with a sloped hat and a dry cough. He handed it over without meeting her eye, then rode off without another word. She folded the paper once and placed it beneath her sewing tin. The trial date was set for mid-September. She spent the weeks leading up to it teaching Olive her letters and letting Oliver read from the Psalms aloud, though she never asked him to. When Tilly came by with a satchel of ledgers and a tin of horehound drops, Winona showed her how to file the attendance sheets by hand. Frank built a lockbox for the school's papers, and when he handed her the key, she didn't ask why his eyes looked tired. She'd seen that look in the mirror once. The morning they left for Cheyenne, the children stayed behind with Tilly. Winona wore the same black dress she'd buried her husband in, the fabric mended at the hem, the collar starched firm. Frank shaved, dressed in a clean shirt, and packed a blanket for the stage ride. They didn't speak much on the way, but he held her hand the whole journey, his thumb brushing hers every now and then like he didn't intend to stop. The courthouse smelled like ink and heat. They sat in the back until her name was called. When she stood, Frank stood too. "No," she said quietly. "Let me walk in first," he nodded once. "I'll be one step behind." Inside, the judge sat high and dry-eyed, his robe pressed, his gavel untouched. The prosecutor, young and full of rehearsed outrage, called her a woman of dangerous independence and unfit for civil society. He asked if she'd poisoned her husband. She said no. He asked if she'd struck him. She said yes. He asked what gave her the right. She answered, "He beat me until I lost a child. I buried that child under a cottonwood tree and never spoke her name again. That's the only sin I'll carry." The courtroom stilled. The judge blinked once, then motioned for the next witness. Tilly spoke with the steady voice of a woman who had buried more than one name. The midwife from Rock Creek gave quiet testimony, her hands clasped tight on her apron. When Frank took the stand, he looked directly at the judge. "They called her a devil's bride," he said. "But she's still the only woman I'll ever want." The judge cleared his throat. The prosecutor shifted in his chair. The jury, 5 men and 3 women, whispered quietly among themselves. The verdict came at dusk, not guilty, no cheers. No gasps, just the silence of something too long coming. Outside, Frank helped her down the courthouse steps. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just took his hand and held it like something sacred. They stayed one night in Cheyenne, took the stage north at first light. When they arrived home, Olive ran to her mother with arms wide, Oliver nodding solemnly from the porch like he'd known the outcome all along. That night, after the children slept, Winona stood barefoot in the field behind the house, the stars clear above her. Frank came to her side, silent. "I gave them my truth," she said, "and they gave it back unbroken." He didn't answer. He just wrapped his coat around her shoulders and stood with her, the earth beneath them steady and whole. By early October, the last of the squash had been pulled from the garden, and the nights came cold enough to keep a fire going from dusk to dawn. The schoolhouse bell rang each morning now, thanks to a small bronze casting Frank had traded for with a settler passing through from Denver. Winona rang it herself. standing tall in her wool shawl as the children from the outlying homesteads filed in, their boots muddy and their eyes bright. The townsfolk had quieted since the verdict. Not all had softened, but the bolder whispers had faded, and a few families had even begun to send their own to learn their letters. Winona never asked for their approval. She taught 6 days a week, made sure each child left with something honest in their heads, and let her work speak for her. One afternoon, while she was reviewing arithmetic with Oliver on the porch steps, Frank came up the path with a wrapped parcel in his arms and a look that made her set her slate aside. "They're building a new telegraph station near Fort Halleck," he said, handing her the package. "Guy working there said they were clearing out the old freight office, found something with your name on it." She opened it slowly, her fingers catching on the twine. Inside lay a worn canvas ledger, and a child's drawing pressed between the pages, a stick figure woman beside 2 smaller ones, all standing beneath a crooked sun. The edges were smudged with old soot. Winona stared down at it, her voice rough in her throat. "I thought this burned." Frank leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. "Guess not everything that goes missing stays lost." She held the drawing to her chest for a moment, then laid it flat again. "Olive made this the night before we left Steele's ranch. I didn't have the heart to take much with us. Then it found its way back." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You always do that, say just enough." He tilted his head. "You want more." "I want to know what kind of man you see yourself as," she said. "You've done more for me than I ever knew a man could." He lowered himself beside her, boots scraping the porch boards. "I'm not trying to be something better than what I am. I've seen enough war and sorrow to know my hands ain't clean. But I figure if I can build something steady, give you and the kids a place where no one raises a hand or raises their voice, then maybe I'll have done something right." She reached out, resting her palm against his. "You already have." They sat like that until Olive ran out to show them a pressed flower she'd tucked into her primer, her cheeks pink from the wind. Winona pulled the girl into her lap, her eyes still fixed on Frank. That night, after supper and the children's soft breathing filled the house, Winona pulled 2 mugs from the shelf and poured a little warmed cider. Frank was carving a handle for a new kettle hook, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, wood shavings scattered near his boots. "I've been thinking about the land west of the river," she said, handing him the mug. "There's enough space for a second schoolroom, maybe even a kitchen garden for the children." He set down the carving knife. "You want to take that on?" "I want to make something that lasts," she said. "Something bigger than just surviving." He reached for her hand, his grip sure. "Then we'll build it together." She nodded once. "I never thought I'd get to choose the shape of my life." He brought her fingers to his lips, kissed the knuckles slowly. "You're shaping mine too." Come winter, the schoolhouse had doubled in size, with a second room framed and roofed before the snow came thick. Tilly moved into the old bunkhouse, where Frank had added a stove and shelf for her ledgers. Oliver began helping with the ranch work in earnest, learning to shoe horses and split kindling without being asked. Olive, now able to write her name without hesitation, took to sewing doll clothes beside Winona in the evenings, her small voice humming tunes no one taught her, only remembered. The new schoolroom opened in the spring, and the first planting was done with every child's hands in the dirt. Winona stood at the edge of the garden, her skirts pinned up, her hair braided tight, and watched something grow that had never been allowed to before belonging. Frank built a bench beneath the cottonwoods where they had spoken their vows. He carved their initials into the wood with the tip of his knife, not for show, but for the simple fact that it mattered. Later that year, when the first frost came early and the valley dipped into silence, Frank and Winona walked the fence line hand in hand, the lantern swinging between them. The moon cast long shadows over the snow-dusted grass, and their breath mingled in the cold. She stopped near the southern gate, her face turned up to his. "I want to grow old where no one forgets what we've done here." He touched her cheek, warm beneath his calloused palm. "You will, and I'll be beside you." She kissed him slow, the kind that didn't ask for anything and gave everything. They walked home in the quiet, the kind that didn't need filling. Years passed, but the porch post stayed straight. The school bell rang steady, and Winona's garden bloomed deeper each season. The town never forgot what she'd done, and the children who once sat at her desk grew up with a different kind of truth inside them. One shaped by gentleness, steadiness, and the kind of love that didn't flinch. And when the wind came hard across the plains, as it always did, it never once shook the house that Frank Jude and Winona Steele built together.